and welcome to Conversations with IFS, with me, your host, Jemima Nunoo. Conversations with IFS is brought to you by the Institute for Fiscal Studies and is curated by Iva Ajimandia. Today, we have a very experienced and knowledgeable guest on our program. She's a lady with over 25 years experience in development practice. She's a journalist, an international consultant, a director at one of Ghana's top think tanks, and so much more. She holds degrees from the University of Ghana, London School of Economics, and the School of Oriental and African Studies. She's worked with various organizations, including UNDP, the ILO, United Nations Economic Commission for Africa, and many more. I'm talking about none other than Dr. Dede Amanor-Wilks. And right after the break, she'll be on our show. Stay tuned. Thank you for keeping with us. Welcome, Dr. Amanor-Wilks, to Conversations with IFS.
Thank you very much for having me here.
I'm sure we'll have a very, very informed and enlightening discussion. First of all, I'd like to ask you, you've had lots of experience in various developmental areas across Eastern, Southern, and Western Africa, dealing with various issues, gender, land economy, etc. So what kinds of trends have you seen throughout the continent, and how have things changed?
How things have changed? Well, in the last, let's say the period since independence, the last 50 to 60 years, if you look at the overall structure of many African economies, not much has changed very positively. We're talking about the structure of the economy, we're talking about the relationship between agriculture and manufacturing industry and the services sectors. And you can see that the independence promise, and the promise was really about a shift from traditional agriculture into perceived modern manufacturing. That really hasn't taken place since the independence era, the first decade after independence. And what we see now is a worrying trend where agriculture appears to be contributing less to GDP. And this is not because manufacturing is expanding. Indeed, manufacturing seems to be stagnant, if not declining. And rather it's the services sector that has expanded. But this is a little bit puzzling. Although there's a lot of euphoria currently about the services sector and a lot of talk about Africa leapfrogging from agriculture to services, it's not very clear to me how that can be achieved when you look at the function of manufacturing, the importance of manufacturing in the overall economy. When you look at the shift from agriculture to manufacturing, that was really the tenet of modernization theory, which held sway in the 1950s and the 1960s, that labor would move from backward, or let's say underperforming, low productivity agriculture into high productivity manufacturing. And manufacturing is much higher productivity than agriculture because of the nature of factory production, that we use machines and that we specialize in certain tasks, so that whereas in agriculture everybody performs all of the tasks, in manufacturing you have people performing very specific tasks, and that makes productivity grow. But if we're saying that we're bypassing manufacturing and moving to services, then we have to ask, do we have that sort of industrial culture that manufacturing brings about? You know how the factory is. Everything is very sort of organized, the bell rings at, you have to be there on the shop floor, you have to be there at 9 o'clock. In Africa, we tend to start work at 8 o'clock and you work till 5 p.m. It's not the same in agriculture. It's freer, people move with a with the seasons, things change according to the seasons and so forth. But if we say we're moving to services, do we have that kind of discipline, industrial culture? And what services are we talking about? So maybe we could be talking about tourism, we could be talking about the hospitality industry, we could be talking about entertainment. And one area that perhaps is working very well, I would say, across Africa is mobile phone services. You can see that that has really been expanding in the last few years. But whether we are able to leapfrog from agriculture to services is a very big question that I think needs looking at.
So what are the main differences you've seen between the different regions you've worked in, let's say Eastern Africa compared to Western Africa and compared to Southern Africa? What are the main differences?
I would say that the most striking difference I've seen is the difference between the former settler economies and what were known as the peasant or peasant export economies.
Can you expand on that a
Yes.
little?
Two examples would be of the peasant export economy, Ghana, and of the settler economy, Zimbabwe, where I lived for 10 years. So it really comes down to a question of land. In the peasant economy, land was left in African hands. In the settler economy, land was alienated from African peasants to European settlers. And that has really had a big impact on the structure of the economies in those countries over the last 50 or 60 years. However, you now see that in the recent period, the differences seem to be less stark, because now you have similar challenges facing African countries across all of the continent. What was striking about the settler economies is that you had more manufacturing industry, whereas now there's been deindustrialization since the 1980s and 90s. And so everybody is sort of facing quite similar challenges. But land is an important question to understand, because what, to a large extent, determined those differences? If you look at Ghana and Zimbabwe. In Ghana, there was talk, at one time there was a land commission set up. It was called the West African Lands Commission. And the task of the commission was to decide whether land should be alienated from Ghanaians, then Gold Coasters, and given to European planters. And the argument then for not expropriating land was that the cocoa farmers, who they said had beaten all the records in the world. And what is often not understood was that Ghana's cocoa revolution came about spontaneously. It wasn't that the colonial government imposed the growing of cocoa. But we all know the story of Tete Kwashi, who brought the cocoa seedlings from Fernando Po and started this cocoa revolution. And because of cocoa, because what Ghanaian cocoa farmers were doing was amazing.
They owned it.
And not only that, they were creating surplus, they were creating capital for the colonial government to send to UK. So we know that at the time of independence, Ghana had this surplus, this money that had been accumulated in the UK, and that was largely as a result of the industry of the cocoa farmers, as well as Ghana's natural endowments in gold.
Yeah.
Whereas in the settler economy, Zimbabwe, 70% of the fertile land was alienated and given to European settlers. Now, what is interesting there is that because the settlers had an interest in creating an economy for themselves, you have more manufacturing industry. So whereas in Ghana everything was extracted and sent to Europe, cocoa was sent there to be turned into chocolate, gold was sent there. In Zimbabwe they had an interest in developing the domestic economy. So they were building a manufacturing base. Because they were kith and kin, we can say they were kith and kin, Britain kind of tolerated them competing in manufacturing with them. So they were able to build a more mature economy, a more diversified economy with more manufacturing industry than we find in the peasant economies.
So in your own personal terms, which development model has been, for want of a better word, so far the most successful?
Now that is a very complex question, and it depends what you're looking at. Today, we're living in an era where human rights are considered paramount. And in an era of human rights, there's no way you can justify taking over land, expropriating peasants, throwing them off the land, as happened in many industrial revolutions around the world. That's what happened in Britain. Peasants were thrown off the land, and that's how the first industrial revolution started. Now, when it comes to the East Asian miracle economies, we can see that there too, this kind of what would be considered a human rights abuse today was tolerated in the context of World War II, where Japan had been defeated in the war, and Japanese landlords were then thrown off their lands in countries such as South Korea and Taiwan, and those lands were taken over by indigenous Taiwanese and South Koreans. Now we have a complicated situation where Zimbabwe in 2000 decides to expropriate the land. It started actually spontaneously in 1997 when war veterans, veterans who felt that they were not benefiting from Zimbabwe's independence, spontaneously started invading farms. Then in 2000, then President Robert Mugabe, seeing that he was possibly going to be swept aside, he then endorsed it, and land reform became official government policy. But you can see the outcry that arose. Internationally, Zimbabwe became a pariah yet again, because during the last era, the last decade of the Rhodesian era, it was also a pariah when sanctions were imposed against Ian Smith after he declared his unilateral declaration of independence. Rhodesia became a pariah. After independence, Zimbabwe was seen as a model, and indeed they expanded education, services, really expanded to the African majority, including to women. But then because of this issue of land reform, Zimbabwe has again been a pariah. So it's difficult to say that, so in Ghana, Ghanaians will probably not agree that this is the better model, because in a way it depends whether you would rather have political freedom or economic advancement. And that's a very, very difficult question to weigh up.
Okay. So throughout your work, you will have, you've worked in Eastern Africa, and the economies of the Eastern African countries seem to be more integrated than here in West Africa. So what lessons, if any, could we learn from the way in which they've managed to integrate their economies?
More integrated in terms of regional integration, which is also the dream of the founding fathers of Africa, like Kwame Nkrumah and Julius Nyerere. So the East African community seems to be the regional economic community that is moving the fastest towards regional integration. They have already established a common market for goods, labor, and services. They're making moves towards monetary union. They've expanded the free trade area with two other blocks, SADC and COMESA, and they are making moves towards full political integration. Now, it is a fact that the East African community is smaller than some of the other communities, such as ECOWAS, which has both Anglophone and Francophone countries, a much bigger gathering. And maybe because there are only 6 countries, it may be that it's easier for them to reach agreement on these protocols. Another factor, I think, which is very important is the fact of the Kiswahili language. I think that has created a great amount of social cohesion in East Africa than perhaps in other regions, which is not to say that we don't migrate in other regions. In West Africa, West Africans migrate a lot. There's a lot of migration, but perhaps it's easier when you all speak one language to do more than just migrate, but to sort of come to agreement on certain things you all need to work on together to make it one market. And those would explain some of the factors that have favored East African integration.
So what do you think about West African integration in terms of the ECOWAS platform? How can it be furthermore integrated?
Yes, there is. I mean, ECOWAS wants to integrate. People are moving across borders, but it's the protocols are there, but somehow we're not respecting them. It's easier for people to fly, I believe, to fly to countries within West Africa. You don't need a visa, but for people crossing the land borders, they seem to face a lot of harassment. You know, women crossing, traders in border areas face a lot of harassment, intimidation, demands for bribes when they cross borders with their goods. So there's still a lot of work to do.
So what do you think are the key problems? Because, yeah, fair enough, we don't have a lingua franca like the East African countries do, but there must be more than that as to what is preventing us from truly integrating as a Western African bloc.
I would say it comes down in the end to political will, the quality of leadership. Because when you look at East Africa, you see that we have leaders like Kagame in Rwanda. Until recently, Ethiopia. The Ethiopian Prime Minister just stepped down, but nevertheless, Ethiopia is an example of what is being termed the developmental state in Africa. Tanzania is making great inroads in terms of infrastructure and determination to stamp down on corruption. The developmental state is another difficult concept.
Quite controversial as well,
controversial, yes, because it often involves, there's greater state autonomy, but with it comes sort of less respect for human rights. And so that, as probably we all hear about Kagame, there's this sort of controversy over, is Kagame the greatest leader? Is he, a human rights abuser? And the thing about the developmental state is that you have greater autonomy to bring on board those policies that can really bring about economic transformation, but sometimes it's at a cost. And when you look at, going back to the East Asian economy, somewhere like South Korea, General Park, what is often not understood is how the East Asian miracle occurred. So we've talked about the land to begin with. So land was brought back, and that was one of the initial conditions that created those conditions of equity, together with investment in education, that allowed that to happen. But General Park, as keen as he was on having manufacturing, and it must be understood that manufacturing industry industrialization doesn't just happen by itself. All my research shows. So what General Park did was he did give subsidies to South Korea's industries, the huge industries that they have there now. However, it came at a very high price. For example, you would be given a subsidy, and if you didn't, for instance, I'm giving you a subsidy to build a shipping industry, but if you don't create that industry within 10 years, it's off to jail. And that's how a lot of what we term the East Asian miracle happened.
Harsh consequences.
Harsh consequences. And it seems that in Africa, Kagame is the one who's prepared to inflict that kind of pain. And that has also resulted in a lot of criticism. But because of Rwanda's peculiar history, because of that history of the genocide, I think people have tolerated Kagame in a way that they might not tolerate such leaders in other countries. Ethiopia too has got away with quite a lot, and Ethiopia has in recent years built light rail. It's very impressive. However, that's also come at a social cost, and the reason the last Prime Minister stepped down was because of the social conflict from the different regions of Ethiopia, especially the Oromo, who felt that they have been left out of the economy.
Okay. So it's kind of like the economic costs being weighed up against the social costs.
Precisely.
And seeing
precisely.
Okay. I think it's time that we take a break now. We'll come back and we'll discuss more about the Africa Centre for Economic Transformation's recent reports on the land economy and agriculture in Ghana. Stay tuned. Welcome back to Conversations with IFS, brought to you by the Institute for Fiscal Studies. Today, my guest is Dr. Dede Amanor-Wilks, who is the Director for Communications and External Relations at the Africa Centre for Economic Transformation. Dr. Amanor-Wilks, welcome back again.
Thank you.
We've got some recent reports from the Africa Centre for Economic Transformation on land economy and agriculture. I'd like you to give us some briefings on the findings of these reports.
Okay, well, I brought an overview of this is our flagship publication,
Thank you.
the African Transformation Report 2017. Our first one was in 2014. And this one focuses on agriculture.
Okay.
And as you see, it's called Agriculture Powering Africa's Economic Transformation. So the key finding is that agriculture can contribute to the economic transformation of Africa, but provided that we raise productivity in agriculture, and also link agriculture to manufacturing through, for example, agro-processing and the production of farm implements. And there is one proviso too, that we need to replace the current pattern of jobless growth with a kind of growth that creates jobs and which is also good for human welfare. So you know there is this sort of conundrum in Ghana. Ghana is seen now as, again, Ghana is the model economy. You know, Ghana was the model colony.
Yeah.
Now Ghana is still the model economy in Africa because we're, again, touted to be the fastest growing economy this year.
Yes.
It's believed that Ghana will be the fastest, as it was a few years ago when oil first was discovered, came on stream. But the conundrum is that we're growing, and yet where are the jobs? We know that the youth population is growing. We have a youth boom. We have a youth bulge. There are more and more youths coming out of schools and colleges and universities every year, but there aren't the jobs for them. That is the dilemma of jobless growth. So the report looks at how we can improve agriculture to enable it to play that function of powering economic transformation. So it looks at various things. It looks at how you raise productivity in agriculture. For example, yes. So how is by giving farmers access to knowledge and inputs. It looks at issues of land tenure, that there's reform needed in land tenure because when you look at for instance, agriculture is now not very attractive to the youth. And it's not just because it's associated with drudgery, which it is, because we're still using just the hoe, which is the implement we've always used, but also because it's very difficult for youths to get access to land. And without land, how do you farm? And then the subdivision of lands between families means that the lands are getting smaller and smaller. So therefore, there's some reform that's needed, not just in the sector economies that we talked about, not just in a country like Zimbabwe to expand access to land, but even in countries like Ghana where we have an abundance of land still, but it's not accessible to most people.
Okay. So then you talked about, did you talk about anything else to do with raising productivity in terms of technological advancement?
Yeah.
I mean, I looked at the impact of genetically modified organisms or genetically modified agriculture. Does the report look at anything like that, using biotechnology or anything?
Well, it looks at issues like commercializing agriculture. That's maybe more basic, sort of through markets, improving markets, giving farmers access to services like insurance to mitigate the risks. Farming is a very risky business. If the weather turns, if there's drought or the weather does something funny, you can lose your crop. So how do we insure them? As they do in the southern African countries that have more access to insurance services. In terms of GMOs, the report doesn't mention GMOs. It's a controversial issue. We're aware of that. It does, I mean, it's recognized that things like biotechnology are issues that we need to look into, and it's linked to the curriculum. In Ghana, it doesn't seem that we are all that serious about economic development when you look at the education curriculum, because there isn't that emphasis on science and technology and all of these things. So we can't even begin to think about biotechnology really until we address issues of the curriculum. But in terms of inputs, yes, we do talk about giving farmers more access to the kinds of inputs that can enable them to improve their productivity.
So from your report, the agricultural sector is one way, a potential way of absorbing a lot of the unemployed youth that we find coming out of universities or secondary cycle institutions that, you know, are looking for jobs and are unable to find them.
And it absolutely should be, and I believe that the current government recognizes that it has to be, because agriculture is the area where there's a lot of abundance. There's all this unused land, which we're not putting to use. And if we could put it to good use, then we could absorb more youth into the sector. And we need to absorb that because that's where the majority of Africans are already engaged in agriculture. So we have this abundant land, we have the bulk of the population employed there, and yet we haven't yet been able to raise the productivity of agriculture, and that's where good policy interventions are necessary.
And I do like the link where you said where we need to look at maybe looking at more agriculture in terms of agribusiness side, so looking at the processing, adding value addition.
Yes.
Does the report talk more about that?
It does talk a lot about agribusiness and also about finding a role for educated youth. So it's not just a dilemma of youth, but the educated youth find it more difficult to find jobs than uneducated youth.
Indeed.
And so it's finding a role for them both on farm and maybe in off-farm value chains, agricultural value chains. What can they be? With the mobile phone technology we have now, there's a lot of potential. Youths are very interested in this technology. If we can somehow support them to use these not too expensive forms of technology to set up agribusinesses, that would really help to propel the economy.
Fortunately, some of the youth I know, I taught agribusiness at GIMPA, and there were some, I think it was Farmerline that came, and they were using these mobile phone technologies to inform farmers of best practice, or I think even in terms of weather forecasts or different things, to be using mobile networks.
And youths are coming up with creating their own apps and really creative stuff. If they could just be nurtured a bit, there's a lot that could happen.
But moving on,
But another area we talk about is the role of women too.
Okay.
Gender equity is very important because you have half of the population, just over half the population, who are there on the land, but also don't have access to land and are not supported to really play their role in agriculture. So agricultural transformation also depends, economic transformation also depends on women playing a more transformative role in agriculture.
Does the report suggest ways in which women can?
There is a chapter actually on gender, and yes, there's a lot there that we could go into. Yeah.
Sounds interesting. But what other sectors of the economy, as you said earlier, we do have this big issue of a high percentage of unemployed youth. It's been recognized. But are there any other sectors of the economy that you think, apart from the agricultural sector, that can also are ripe to absorb these unemployed youth?
It's a challenge because the manufacturing sector is not expanding, and therefore there's no real question of how can they absorb. But manufacturing always historically has needed support from government. It needs subventions, subsidies and so forth. It needs government support. It's only in the first industrial revolution that you find that it happened spontaneously. In all other industrial revolutions, it was the government that supported, state-supported manufacturers to be able to do this. So apart from agriculture, in the primary sector, you also have extractives. Now here we have a very big problem because Galamsey has been absorbing a lot of youth, but this is at a great cost to the country. All of our waterways are now polluted. And this, I think, is making the government sit up and really think about what can we do in terms of policy interventions to give an alternative to these youths other than Galamsey, because it is really destroying waterways and farmlands. Agriculture seems to be the area where there's the greatest potential, because once you improve productivity in agriculture, then you'll have more input to manufacturing. Agriculture can stimulate manufacturing, but if agriculture itself is stagnant, then there's not much that manufacturing can draw from. So then looking at the services sector, I suppose the informal sector is having to do the work. Now the informal sector, because it's not supported, it's really about underemployment. You have a lot of people there, but not doing very much. So we really need to draw a lot of that underutilized labor in the informal sector.
But I remember Mo Ibrahim picturing agriculture as almost a catalyst, like you've said, through which other sectors can then further off the back of agric, further catapult and then maybe absorb some of the youth that are there looking for jobs. So I was thinking, what other kind of, catalytic uses can agriculture be? For jobs, yes, but what other ways can it help speed up or help our development generally?
So agriculture is a catalyst in Africa because, as we said, most people are concentrated there, and because we have all of this underutilized land. Agriculture can be linked to different sectors of the economy. We've already talked about linking it to manufacturing through agro-processing. Services, now that we have these mobile phone applications, that's another way. We need to link agriculture to the financial services sector. And actually ACET has just started doing research on financial inclusion, how we can bring more women and youth into financial, how we can develop financial services to reach women and youth, especially in rural areas. Then you'd be able to make that link between agriculture and modern services such as banking services. At the moment that link is not very clear. Banks don't really want to lend to people in rural areas because it's not very easy for them to get their money back. And so there's not really the credit. The credit facilities don't exist to really link manufacturing, so to link agriculture to all the other sectors. So there's still a lot that needs to be done before this can happen, before agriculture can absorb those jobless youths.
Is it because you think the finance sector doesn't understand maybe the rural economy or the agricultural economy? Is it?
It's not that they don't understand it, but they're afraid of the risk. And that's where insurance could also help. And that's where land becomes a critical factor for those who subscribe to the view that it is land that gives collateral. Not everybody subscribes to that view because we also recognize that people have access to land and use and feel they own land even though they don't have the title. And they can't necessarily use it as collateral. And that is the argument for giving title, that people would then be able to use that title to get collateral. On the other hand, it's not clear that even if you have a title to a small piece of land in the rural areas, it's not clear that any bank would give you. But it would become, there'd be a new sort of dynamic process in place, and that could give rise to all kinds of things that we haven't even begun to imagine yet.
It seems we really need to de-risk our agricultural sector to make it more attractive.
Yes,
I think that's
it is very risky, yes.
I think that's
you can lose everything in one season if you make the wrong decision or plant on the wrong day, yes. Our weather is less harsh than perhaps in some other regions. For example, in Zimbabwe, what I remember is that farmers used to insure against hail, because at a certain time of the year you have hailstorms and you could have your whole crop wiped out. Perhaps, necessity is the mother of invention, and in Ghana we're a bit too comfortable. Our weather is kind to farmers to the greatest extent, but sometimes we have droughts and we have to be able to insure against that risk.
Yes, and we've not been so successful all the times in managing these, even the risks that we have. We don't have, safety nets for them to manage.
Precisely, we do need more safety nets.
Okay, but moving on from agriculture, you've also done some work or some research in our textile industry as well, and looking at issues to do with our textiles industry. I would just like you to give us a little bit about what you've done there, and some of the interesting bits of research and findings that you've had there.
Okay, so I developed an interest in textiles while I was doing research comparing Ghana and Zimbabwe over a period of 100 years, from the colonial period through to 2000. And what struck me, one of the most striking differences was I couldn't understand why in the settler economy something like kente weaving doesn't exist. Those sort of proto-industries seem to have been wiped out with the impact of settler colonization, whereas in a country like Ghana, kente flourishes. I started by looking at large-scale manufacturing in the two countries and found that both of them have come under a lot of pressure in the last decades. So we see that in Ghana, most of the textile companies have folded. A lot of the textile jobs have gone. Now we only have GTP, Akosombo, and Printex, and a lot of the jobs have gone. The same thing happened in Zimbabwe under the impact of structural adjustment. There was one big company there called Cone Textiles, which lost 6,000 textile jobs at one sweep. But what has survived the impact of all these forces is proto-industries like the kente weavers. And I really take my hat off to the weavers, that they have managed to survive all the forces of globalization. The Chinese coming and copying their designs have not managed to put them out of business. And I think, similarly to agriculture, although we've still got our hoe, in as much as we're complaining that the technology hasn't changed, when you look at the weaving sector, it's actually that low technology that has enabled them to survive the forces of globalization. A few years ago, there was a project at East Legon, and they invited some of the Kente weavers to come from Bonre, which is the original royal weaving center in Asante. And they wanted to teach them to use broad looms. What is characteristic about our Kente is it's woven on narrow looms. And so that's why we have these narrow strips that are sewn together to make the Kente cloth. But with a broad loom, you have a bigger piece, a bigger piece of Kente. And so they brought some of the weavers, the master weavers from Bonre. They stayed in Accra for 3 months. But then I think they started getting worried that if they were to switch to the broad loom technology, they could more easily lose their niche, that it could more easily be taken over by. They brought some broadloom weavers from India to teach them how to use the loom. But I think they could see that it would be easier for people to copy their designs and take Kente away from Ghana. So I take my hat off to them for being able to survive these forces of globalization by hanging on to a technology which anybody can own. It's relatively cheap. You can construct your own loom if you can't afford to pay a carpenter to make one. You can carry your loom with you anywhere. You can cross borders. You can even go to America and set up a loom and be weaving your Kente. And what I've found very interesting in Bonre through my research is that although now a lot of people are interested in education, so apprenticeships start much later than they used to when children would start at age 6 to learn how to weave. Still, even when kids have been to school, they hang on to their looms because they find that after the free SHS has only just come in, but after they finish JHS, just the free 6 years of education, they can go back to their looms, weave a few Kente cloths, earn some money that can take them back to school to better their education. That's one of the most interesting things I found in Bonre.
Okay. It's time for a quick break now. We'll be back more with our guest today, Dr. Dede Amanor-Wilks. Stay tuned. Hello, welcome back to Conversations with IFS with me, your host Jemima Nunoo, and our special guest today, Dr. Dede Amanor-Wilks. Welcome back again. So in the previous section we were talking about your work in the textile industry and some of the things you found, especially to do with the Kente weaving. In your research, did you look at the textile industry's contribution to GDP?
So if we look at the formal sector, we're talking about large-scale manufacturing, and that sector has had a very, very hard time. During Kufuor's time, textiles was made a special initiative, special presidential initiative. I was very interested because that was a time that I was doing my research and going to GTP, conducting interviews with them. It seems like that initiative hasn't really gone far enough, and I believe the current government is interested in renewing some of these issues, the one district, one factory. Now, textiles, I think, is one area that Ghana should focus on. And I just want to briefly reference one of my favorite economic historians, somebody called Hirschman. Otto Hirschman. Now, Hirschman was one of the economic historians that came to advise Kwame Nkrumah during the late 1950s and early 1960s. And what I find very interesting about Hirschman, by the way, Hirschman is the economic historian who invented the term linkages. Have you heard of backward and forward linkages? Yeah. So all this talk about linking agriculture to manufacturing is about creating backward and forward linkages. That's how you have an integrated economy. But Hirschman said something very interesting to me. He said that the needs of a developing economy are so great that it can't do everything. So what it has to do is identify those areas that have the greatest potential to drag the rest of the economy behind them. And for me, the reason I focused on textiles is because I feel that textiles is one of those areas. We have this natural comparative advantage, I believe, in textiles, because of something like Kente, which is now a world brand.
Yeah,
Increasingly, it's a global brand. People recognize Kente, they associate it with Ghana. It's one of the things, when you say Ghana, people think about Kente, among other things. Nkrumah is one, the Black Stars, footballers is another, but Kente is also one. Then our love for textiles, our wax prints too, the textiles that GTP and others, Akosombo and Printex, put out, they're beautiful.
Yes.
And they're becoming respected and admired outside of Africa too. We know that already in the other parts of Africa, for instance in Southern Africa, there's great demand for West African textiles. Outside Africa too, the demand is growing. People are looking to, Asian textiles have been popular for a long time. Now people are looking for the next thing. The market is looking for the new, what is next, what is new? And African textiles are starting to catch attention. Among them, Kente really has a special role to play. Now, Kente is in the informal sector. Kente has always depended to some extent on state patronage. It started because of royal patronage from the Asantehene, in the case of Asante Kente. So it was the Asantehene who would order his cloths. In fact, to this day, the Asantehene's cloths are mostly woven in Bonre. And there's a special, the Bonrehini is not in charge of Kente, there's a Kentehini also. And his cloths are woven in secret. Nobody is allowed to see what is being woven for the Asantehene until he has woven it. Because you're not allowed to copy the Asantehene's cloth. And so only after he's woven it can other people copy that cloth. And so because of this patronage, that is what has enabled Kente to survive for the last 300 years. But as the demand for Kente grows, there's not just the royal clan that now wants Kente cloth. All Ghanaians use Kente for weddings, for special occasions, for graduation. The universities now put Kente on their graduation gowns. And then even beyond our borders, there's the whole African diaspora, especially in the United States. African Americans have really embraced Kente. They also use Kente for graduation purposes. They associate Kente with Pan-Africanism and their own struggles, their civil rights struggles. And so a lot of African American tourism now comes to Ghana. And it's not just the slave tourism. And understandably, most African Americans want to go to the slave castles and understand their history better. A lot of them also go to the weaving centers like Bonre, and they want to go and interact with Kente weavers, see how it's woven, and also buy Kente cloth. Now, Kente at the moment is in the informal sector, but with a little bit of support. If Kente weavers could be helped to, for example, set up websites, connect to the outside world in a meaningful way, there could be a great contribution to our fiscal balance. We could improve our revenue raising. Kente weavers would be in a position to pay taxes. We don't have enough people paying taxes. It's only formal sector workers, which is a relatively small portion of our population who pay taxes. But if the informal sector could be empowered to earn more income, they could then begin paying more taxes, and that would be good for the overall economy. So there are many things that the government can do to support Kente weavers. By giving them, for example, sheds. There are a few. The Bonwe Kente Weavers Association has been quite successful in getting some support for Kente weavers. They have a center where weavers can come and place their looms. The biggest problem is that the sun and the rain. The sun can damage Kente cloth. So interestingly, in Bonre, you find that, in fact, I did a survey, a 10% survey, and I found that 80% of houses in Bonre have verandas, long verandas where you can put not even one loom, you can put 4 looms. In some of the biggest houses, you can put as many as 10 looms in one of those houses. And so that provides shelter from the sun and from the rain. If they could be supported to create more of such areas where Kente weavers can have more shelter. We would see that industry grow to meet the growing demand internationally.
Okay. What about, are there any gender aspects of the kente weaving, etc., that you found out?
Oh yes, and I devoted one of my chapters in my thesis actually to gender. It's a very interesting issue. When I first went to Bonre, I wanted to interview women kente weavers. I couldn't find any to interview, and I was told there's only one weaver and she's gone to Kumasi, so I couldn't interview her. When I went back recently to do my 10% survey, then I found more women in the households. And I discovered something very interesting, that the reason I couldn't find many women to begin with was because there used to be a traditional taboo. There was a ban on kente weaving for women, because traditionally it was believed that the power of menstrual blood is so strong that if a menstruating woman touches a loom, it would spoil a kente weaver's work. In the sense that the charms that the weaver has placed on his kente loom to bring him good luck in business would be dissolved if a woman were to touch the loom. Now those beliefs have fallen away largely, but still to this day there's still this belief that women shouldn't weave. Now that the ban was lifted a few years ago during the Bonre Kente Weaving Festival, there was a woman called Yaminka who threw out a challenge to the chiefs. She said, I want to prove that we women can weave. And the chief said, okay, from now on the ban is lifted. Come back next year and let's see what you've done. And they had a competition, and the women showed that they could weave. From then, the ban was lifted, but you still find that there's this resistance. So you go in some of the households and you find that brothers will teach their younger sisters while they're young. They'll teach them to weave. But once the girl gets to 13, 14, 15, once she gets to 16, they don't want to support them anymore. Partly because it's competition for the men. Partly there's still this belief that women shouldn't weave. And they often say, some of the weavers say, if my wife and I, if we're both weaving, then who will stand up for the other to go and cook? To go and cook? The woman has to go and cook, therefore I can't afford for my wife to be cooking. Or the brothers will say, if I support this, my younger sister, she's going to leave the household and take her skills somewhere else. So we don't, what's the point of wasting money to train women to weave when they're going to leave the household? So those sorts of attitudes persist. But increasingly, there are women who are determined to learn, and they are able to succeed. I've met some master weavers who are women who do very well, but women need support. They need a special kinds of support. It's not so much to get the loom. It's not very difficult to get them. People share looms, they can lend you a loom. It's not that difficult. But the yarns, this is a big issue. For women and for youths, it's very difficult because the yarns now are imported. When the kente industry was first created, we relied on locally grown cotton. The Asante forests have cotton trees. And then cotton was also grown in the north of Ghana. The north of Ghana supports cotton farming very well. But what happened, and when I was doing my research, I actually traveled to Tamale to try and understand what has happened to our cotton production, both for the kente weaving, but also for textiles generally. And I was told that when we used to use our Dagomba cotton, they said, everything was fine, but when they brought in the new forms of cotton, it was very labor intensive, and we lost interest in growing cotton. So these are issues, I think these are policy issues that if the government understands some of these issues, they can be addressed. And then we could have a more integrated industry. It won't be easy now, because after years, we've become a very import-dependent economy. And you see that there was an article recently in Business and Financial Times, about 3 or 4 weeks ago. Somebody argued that the CD is overvalued, because we're so dependent on imports that the government is afraid to allow the CD to devalue, because then imports will become expensive and everybody wants to be importing their luxury goods. Whereas if we were really interested in promoting exports, we would allow the CD to devalue as China has done, because then we would get more money for our cocoa, gold, and if we were manufacturing exports, then we would want them to do better. But the fact is that we seem to be placing more value on imports than on manufacturing and exporting our manufactures. And in that context, it's very difficult to see how we will revive our cotton industry, because certainly it will require government support and government intervention, whereas the dominant model has been that governments shouldn't intervene in the economy and that we should allow markets to take care of the economy until these developmental state type leaders emerge, such as the Kagames and Meles Zenawi in Ethiopia, who decided that no, they were going to try and reorient the economy and create what is needed to make the African economy more transformative. So for a government that is interested in economic development and economic transformation, I believe that cotton and textiles is one place where we have comparative advantage and where we could create those linkages between agriculture and manufacturing very easily.
Okay. On that note, I'd like to say thank you. It's been a very interesting conversation. But many of you might not know that Dr. Amanor-Wilks speaks, is it 6 international languages?
I used to speak a lot of languages. I started my background, I started as a linguist. I started learning languages before I got interested in
Can we
African
count how many languages?
I've learned. Okay, I did my first degree in French and German.
French, German.
I learned Spanish.
Spanish.
I learned Russian.
Russian.
And I've learned a bit of Portuguese.
A little bit of Portuguese.
Yes.
So I'm going to let our special guest say goodbye and tune in next week in any of your chosen languages, please.
Okay, well, to say goodbye, which language? All of them. До свидания in Russian. До свидания is goodbye. Tune in. Wow, tune in. That's very cool and tune in. Okay. Nos vamos la semana que viene. We'll see each other next week.
Wonderful. We'll see each other next week. Goodbye and see you next week.